Imagine boarding a flight where every detail feels wrong. An old aircraft, an airline no one trusts, and a cabin crammed with more weight than it should ever carry. Passengers buckle in, unaware that within minutes, this journey will turn into one of the most devastating air disasters in West Africa. This wasn't just an accident. It was the result of ignored warnings, overlooked safety checks, and an airline that gambled with lives. This is the story of UTA Flight 141, the worst airline experience you've never heard of. The plane assigned to UTA Flight 141 was a McDonnell Douglas DC-932. At one time, the DC-9 was a symbol of modern aviation, a reliable short-haul jet that carried millions of passengers safely across the world. But by 2003, this aircraft was no longer cutting edge. It was an aging machine, decades old, with countless hours in the sky and parts that had long passed their prime. In wealthier countries, planes like this were already being retired. Yet in parts of Africa, they were still flying, often with limited resources for maintenance. UTA, short for Union des Transports Africains, was a private carrier operating out of Guinea. It was not well known globally, and that obscurity hid deeper problems. Regulators had long raised concerns about oversight in the region, airlines with limited funding, stretched crews, and aircraft maintenance that often depended on what could be done quickly, not what should be done thoroughly. To many locals, UTA symbolized a risky but necessary option, affordable flights connecting cities where roads were dangerous or nearly impassable. Passengers boarding. Flight 141 that day likely noticed the cramped conditions, the boxes and bags being forced into the hold, and the overall disorder that surrounded departures. But for them, this was normal. Air travel in the region had its own rules. And overloading, both in terms of baggage and passengers, was something people had come to expect. What no one could see, however, was how dangerously close this particular flight was to crossing the line between barely functional and fatally unstable. The combination of an overworked aircraft, an airline with questionable practices, and an airport environment where oversight was minimal set the stage for tragedy. Flight 141 was more than just a routine journey. It was a gamble with lives. It was the morning of January 25, 2003, and at Yamoussoukro Airport in Ivory Coast, UTA Flight 141 was preparing for departure to Lagos, Nigeria. The airport was crowded, buzzing with passengers carrying everything from oversized bags to tied-up boxes of goods. The boarding process was chaotic. Families were pushing forward, luggage kept piling in, and the ground crew had little authority or incentive to say no. Reports later suggested that the aircraft was not just at full capacity, but heavily overloaded, far beyond its safety limits. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into narrow, worn-out seats. Some travelers were flying for business, others to reunite with family, but most had no idea of the risks they were taking. The flight crew went through the motions of pre-flight checks, but cracks in the system were already showing. Weight distribution was off, baggage was improperly secured, and the aircraft's engines would soon be asked to do far more than they were designed for. As the DC-9 taxied onto the runway, there was no outward sign of the danger ahead. To the passengers, it was just another takeoff, the familiar roar of engines, the vibrations through the floor, the sudden pull as the plane accelerated. But what they couldn't see was that the aircraft was struggling from the very start. Its engines strained, the fuselage heavy with excess cargo, the wings fighting against physics itself. In those final moments, as the wheels lifted from the tarmac, UTA Flight 141 was already in trouble. It was the morning of January 25, 2003, and at Yamoussoukro Airport in Ivory Coast, UTA Flight 141 was preparing for departure to Lagos, Nigeria. The airport was crowded, buzzing with passengers carrying everything from oversized bags to tied-up boxes of goods. The boarding process was chaotic. Families were pushing forward, luggage kept piling in, and the ground crew had little authority or incentive to say no. Reports later suggested that the aircraft was not just at full capacity, but heavily overloaded, far beyond its safety limits. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into narrow, worn-out seats. Some travelers were flying for business, others to reunite with family, but most had no idea of the risks they were taking. The flight crew went through the motions of pre-flight checks, but cracks in the system were already showing. Weight distribution was off, baggage was improperly secured, and the aircraft's engines would soon be asked to do far more than they were designed for. As the DC-9 taxied onto the runway, there was no outward sign of the danger ahead. To the passengers, it was just another takeoff, the familiar roar of engines, the vibrations through the floor, the sudden pull as the plane accelerated. But what they couldn't see was that the aircraft was struggling from the very start. Its engines strained, the fuselage heavy with excess cargo, the wings fighting against physics itself. In those final moments, as the wheels lifted from the tarmac, UTA Flight 141 was already in trouble. The DC-9 thundered down the runway, engines straining under the crushing load. At first, everything looked normal. Passengers felt the familiar surge in their chests, the force of acceleration pushing them back into their seats. But as the aircraft lifted into the sky, it was clear something was wrong. Instead of climbing smoothly, the jet staggered. Its nose fought upward, its wings trembled under the weight, and the climb was shallow, uncertain, almost desperate. Eyewitnesses on the ground described a haunting sight, the plane rising sluggishly, as if it simply didn't have the strength to keep going. Just moments after takeoff, alarms in the cockpit began to sound. The crew tried to coax more power from the engines, but physics could not be cheated. The aircraft was overloaded, unstable, and dangerously out of balance. Within seconds, the jet lost the fight against gravity. It dipped, shuddered, and veered off course. Then came the plunge. Flight 141 slammed into the shallow lagoon just beyond the airport, breaking apart on impact. The silence of a normal morning was shattered by fire, smoke, and chaos. On board were 169 souls. Only 10 would survive. Families waiting at the airport were left in shock, staring at black smoke curling above the water, realizing that their loved ones were gone. Survivors later recalled the horror, the cold water rushing in, the desperate scramble to escape, and the overwhelming disbelief that the flight had ended so quickly. What should have been a routine journey across West Africa instead became one of the deadliest aviation disasters the region had ever seen. And tragically, it wasn't just fate. It was a preventable catastrophe. In the aftermath of the crash, investigators from the Ivory Coast, Guinea, and international aviation bodies faced a grim task, piecing together how a routine flight had turned into catastrophe within seconds of takeoff. What they found was not just tragic, it was enraging. The wreckage told the first part of the story. The aircraft had been severely overloaded. Passenger manifests were unreliable and in many cases inaccurate. It became clear that more people had boarded than officially recorded. Cargo too was piled in far beyond safe weight limits. Boxes, bags, and personal goods stuffed wherever space could be found. The DC-9 simply could not carry that much weight and still climb safely. But the problems didn't stop there. Investigators revealed that weight distribution had been dangerously unbalanced. Heavy cargo had been loaded unevenly, leaving the aircraft tail-heavy, making takeoff nearly impossible. Even a perfectly functioning DC-9 would have struggled under those conditions. Attention then turned to UTA itself. The airline had a troubling history: outdated aircraft, limited maintenance, and poor oversight. Regulations in the region were weak, and safety checks often amounted to paperwork rather than real inspections. In this case, the culture of cutting corners had reached its breaking point. Witnesses at the airport even claimed they saw baggage handlers struggling to close compartments, warning signs that the plane was far beyond its safe limit. But those warnings went unheeded. Profit mattered more than safety, and the results were devastating. Perhaps the most damning finding was this: the disaster was not a random accident. It was preventable. Every factor, from the overcrowding to the misloaded cargo to the lack of enforcement, was a human failure. UTA Flight 141 didn't just fall from the sky. It was brought down by negligence, greed, and a broken system. In the days following the crash, grief swept across West Africa. Families gathered at the shores of the lagoon, searching for answers, searching for closure. Vigils were held. Officials gave statements. But for many, nothing could explain how such a tragedy had been allowed to happen. For UTA, the crash was the final blow. The airline's reputation, already fragile, was destroyed overnight. International regulators blacklisted the company, passengers abandoned it, and within months, its operations collapsed. UTA's name would forever be tied to failure and loss, remembered not for its service, but for the disaster of Flight 141. The crash also forced the world to look closer at aviation safety in Africa. It highlighted a disturbing pattern: older planes being pushed past their limits, weak oversight, and airlines prioritizing profit over lives. Governments across the region faced mounting pressure to reform, to demand better training, stricter regulations, and real accountability. Yet for the families left behind, reforms and reports were little comfort. They had lost loved ones not to fate but to negligence. And that pain, that unanswered why, would linger long after the smoke cleared. UTA Flight 141 was more than just an air disaster. It became a symbol of what happens when safety is sacrificed for speed, profit, and convenience. One overloaded plane, one overlooked checklist, one ignored warning, and in seconds, 169 lives were gone. But the true tragedy is that it didn't have to end this way. This wasn't an act of nature or an unforeseeable accident. It was preventable. Every decision that led to that takeoff carved the path to disaster. And while UTA itself disappeared into history, the lessons of Flight 141 remain. The haunting question is this: how many more lives must be lost before the world learns that in aviation there are no shortcuts? Because in the sky, every mistake is final.